Planet Institute.
Welcome to R&D Unplugged, a podcast from the Learning Planet Institute dedicated to discussing with researchers on the impact of their work in a simple way. My name is Shahab. Today's guest is Carina Castagna. Hi, Carina.
Hi, Shahab.
Carina, you're a behavioral scientist at the Learning Planet Institute, and you've worked on sustainability with cities and universities across Europe and the US. Your research is focusing on how our brains often unconsciously shape the way we see, judge, and act in the world. We'll get into that in a second, but I want to start with my classic question, which is very unconventional. If your research had a theme song, what would it be and why?
Well, if my research had a theme song, it would be Wasted Love by Gigi. Who represented Austria and won Eurovision this year. So the song captures exactly what I study, what gets thrown away too quickly. It's about love that could have mattered, but wasn't fully seen for what it was. And that's the same emotional logic behind food waste and social exclusion. Because food is emotional, food is love. That's why food waste hurts more than we realize. We are not just throwing away calories. We are throwing away meaning, labor, energy, and even memories. A piece of someone's intention. Wasted Love captures that beautifully. It's about something real and valuable being lost. Not because it lacked worth, but because we failed to recognize it in time.
Wow, I'm completely excited to listen to this song. I don't know this song. This is also probably the most recent song that anybody has chosen. So thank you for that. We're going to dive into the main discussion. And my first question is going to be, what inspired you to pursue this particular research topic?
Well, I grew up in Brazil, where hunger and food waste often coexist on the same street. That contrast always stayed with me, seeing people struggle to access food while perfectly edible produce was discarded by households and supermarkets, simply because it didn't look perfect. That tension sparked a lot of reflection in me, even before I became a researcher. That memory captures the core of what my research aims to unpack. During my PhD, I realized that there was a vivid research gap as we waste enormous amounts of edible food, not because it's unsafe, but because our brains are wired, are programmed to associate visual imperfections with risk and contamination. And this behavior is driven by heuristics, mental shortcuts that once helped us to survive. In prehistoric environments, avoiding food that looked off was a way to steer clear of illness and contamination. So today, our fast brain still relies on these heuristics to make quick decisions. But are they always the right ones? Now, those same instincts lead us to throw away perfectly safe, nutritious food simply because it looks unusual. At the same time, I've always been fascinated by human behavior and the brain, especially how we make decisions that seem irrational from the outside, but actually follow deep subconscious patterns. So when I began exploring food waste through the lens of behavior science, everything started to connect. Risk aversion, visual heuristics. These cognitive mechanisms help explain why we reject ugly but edible food. A major influence on my thinking was the French director Agnès Varda. In The Gleaners and I, she follows people collecting discarded food, ugly food, but a totally natural food from markets and fields, not as a protest, but out of need, as an act of survival. What she reveals so beautifully is the emotional and cultural blindness behind waste. So she asks, what beauty and worth go unseen simply because we have been taught to ignore them? That question stayed with me. it made me wonder, can we learn to see differently, to behave differently, to recognize not just what we throw away, but who we exclude, and what do those choices cost us? But my research isn't only about culture or ethics, it's also about brain. We carry evolutionary instincts that once protected us, but today they often mislead us in the case of the food waste. So my work explores how we can start to unlearn these automatic responses, to rewire and to reprogram how we perceive, how we judge, and assign a value.
That's very interesting. It leads me to my second question. How does your research contribute to the issues that the world is facing right now?
What if I told you your brain could throw away food before you even realize it? That's the core of my research and the purpose of my paper, Beauty is Good, Ugly is Risky. In a series of experiments, I studied the psychological and neural mechanisms that lead people to discard perfectly edible food simply because of how it looks, its aesthetics. I approach food waste not just as a logistical or economic issue, but as a behavior challenge shaped by subconscious cognitive shortcuts, heuristics, and fast automatic decisions made by what we call System 1 brain. A key aim of my work is to uncover those hidden and automatic responses, like risk perception and aesthetics bias, that influence how we judge food. I draw from behavioral science, cognitive neuroscience, and sustainability psychology to understand how the brain reacts to visual cues, using tools like eye tracking and pupillometry. But understanding isn't enough. That's why I go further. I tested interventions to change perception and behavior. Now step back. Globally, we waste 1/3 of all food produced. At the same time, over 800 million people live with food insecurity. These are not separated issues. They reveal a systematic failure, a failure to align abundance with excess. And at the heart of that failure is human behavior. My research zooms in on those everyday micro decisions. The moment someone looks at an oddly shaped apple and silently rejects it. What is happening in that split second? And more importantly, how can we interrupt it? Because food waste isn't just about efficiency. It's about redesigning education to shift perception, not just inform. Even small shifts in perception can lead to systems that are not only more sustainable, but more just. Finally, my work contributes directly to climate and equity goals. Food waste drives massive greenhouse gas emissions. Reducing it is one of the most impactful and achievable climate actions we can take, but only if it's done in ways that are socially grounded. Because sometimes changing the world begins with how we see a bruised apple.
What were some of the key findings from your research? And maybe did you find any results that surprised you?
Yes, definitely. So perhaps let me take you into the lab, or more precisely, into the moment your brain silently judges a piece of fruit. When I began this research, I wanted to understand what happens, not just when people say they prefer the perfect food, but what their eyes and nervous systems reveal in the instant they see and they look at an ugly fruit. So I started with eye tracking. Participants were shown images of regular and irregular fruits and vegetables. And we found that people fixate longer on imperfections. They are visually silent. We measured pupil dilatation as well, and this was a sign of emotional and cognitive arousal and a risk proxy. And that's where it got really interesting, because participants' pupils dilated significantly more when viewing the ugly fruits. This suggests that their brains were experiencing discomfort, uncertainty, or conflict. Next, we wanted to see if we could change that perception, if we could change that risk perception. And then we applied a nudge based on control level theory, which shifts thinking from concrete to abstract. Concrete thinking focuses on details, focus on the how, And abstract thinking focuses on purpose, the why. So when we primed participants to think abstractly, for example, by reflecting on why staying healthy is important, their sensitivity to ugly foods and vegetables dropped. That means that when they later judged food, their aesthetics bias disappeared. Then we tested this in the real world, in grocery stores like the El Corte Inglés and at the university canteen. We used simple nudges, organic labels, reframing messages with why and how, and contextual storytelling. And the behavior changed. People were significantly more likely to choose ugly foods and vegetables not because the food changed, but because their perception had changed. These findings show that by shifting how people think from how to why, from concrete to abstract, we can reshape decisions in the moment they happen. Even deeply ingrained, subconscious responses can be rewired, can be reprogrammed. So it calls for reimagining how we educate perception and shape behavior, not just through facts, not just focusing on a rational brain, but through stories, through emotional sides of the story, through redesigning how we learn.
Very interesting. You covered it somewhat already, but I'm going to ask you anyway, how do you make the bridge between your research and real life? Do you have any anecdote maybe to share with us on the topic?
Yes, definitely. So my research only matters if it is connected back to real life, in my opinion. So for me, that bridge has always been essential. One of the most powerful examples of behavior change I've seen came through a local movement in Portugal while I was doing my PhD called Fruta Feia, or ugly fruit. It connects consumers directly with farmers to buy fruits and vegetables that would otherwise be discarded. Not because they are unsafe, but because they don't meet cosmetics standards. So this Fruta Feia was kind of like a community, right? The idea is simple. Challenge beauty norms in food and reduce waste. But the impact is profound. It reframes value, shifts perception, and restores meaning. I brought that same spirit into my own collaborations. In my project, I did a partnership with El Corte Inglés and we tested behavior nodes directly into store. And we used subtle reframing strategies like effective messages or positive environment impact or reducing food waste to shift the behavior. The results? Purchases went up. People responded not just to the information, but to the emotional framing behind it. More recently, I extended my research beyond the food into plastic waste. So at the Lowlands Festival in the Netherlands, a large cultural event with tens of thousands of participants, we tested whether the construal level mindset could influence how people managed their plastic waste. So when people were prompted to reflect on why sustainability matters in the terms of the abstract thinking instead of how, which is the concrete thinking, they become more mindful and intentional in their behavior. So it was a really interesting spot to test this theory, right?
Yeah.
So today I'm working with researchers, educators, and public institutions in France, the Netherlands, and Brazil to translate these insights into practice. That includes designing behavior tools for food literacy, rethinking public messaging, and even exploring how school cafeteria layouts can nudge perception before the meal even begins. Whether it's a supermarket, a festival, or a classroom, the goal is the same: to bring behavior insights into the systems that feed and sustain us, and to make those systems more human, more just, and more aligned with how people actually think, choose, and change.
Very inspiring. Make those systems more human, more just. That resonates a lot with me. Let me ask you a final question. Let's pretend I'm a young guy, 20 years old. I'm not, but let's just pretend. And I want to change the world. Why should I engage in research, and why should I choose your research topic?
That's a good question. So my advice Start by asking better questions, perhaps, especially the ones people have stopped asking. That's what research is. It's not just about data or publishing papers. It's about learning to see the invisible, about zooming in on everyday behaviors and asking, why does this happen? And how could it be different? I'm currently working on a children's book called What the World Threw Away. It's inspired by my research, but it tells the story in a different way, through the eyes of a child. A child who, like a misshapen fruit, is overlooked. This child feels as she doesn't fit anywhere. Because what we throw away isn't just food. We also discard people, especially those who don't fit. That's why my research is really about not just how we waste resources, but how we waste potential, how we judge based on appearance, on aesthetics, expectations, or bias, often without even realizing it. At first, that shows up in how we treat a bruised apple, but it also shows up in schools, in hiring, in medicine, in who gets seen and who gets overlooked. And children are often the first to feel it. The ones who are different, who don't fit the standard mold, they're often judged too quickly or left behind entirely. That's why I believe research on perception and bias is so important for young people. It shows us that those judgments aren't fixed, that our instincts can be questioned, that empathy can be learned, and I think most importantly, that we can be authentic in our own shape. So if you are 20 years old and want to change the world, I would say this: don't focus only on what's visible. Ask what is missing and ask what is being ignored in systems, in language, in people, in our world. So we start with perception. If you can change how someone sees, you are already changing how they act, and that ripple can go far.
That's very inspiring, and I look forward to reading your children's book. It's going to come out this year, right?
I hope so.
And that wraps up today's episode of the R&D Unplugged podcast. I'm Shahab, your host. A huge thank you to our guest, Carina. Thanks, Carina.
Thank you so much, Ab,
for sharing her valuable insights with us. Also, a big thank you to all of our listeners who joined for today's episode. R&D Unplugged is a Learning Planet Institute podcast. This episode was produced by Annalena Neuro and Shahab Nastar, with recording and editing by Edouard Picard and Jean-Marc Sevin. Don't forget to subscribe to our podcast so you never miss an episode. You can find all of our podcasts and further information about all our activities at our website at learningplanetinstitute.org/podcast. Thanks for listening, and we'll catch you next time. Bye.
Learning Planet Institute.